This was supposed to be a normal hospital visit, until a single cruel insult set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. It was Tuesday morning at St. Mary's General Hospital when Dr. Richard Harrison strode into room 312 with his usual air of superiority. Behind him, Nurse Sarah Chun followed quietly, carrying the patient's chart. She had worked the night shift and was exhausted, but she knew better than to show it around Dr. Harrison. The patient in bed 312, a middle-aged man named David Torres, appeared to be resting with his eyes closed. He had been admitted for routine surgery follow-up. Nothing serious. Just another face in the endless stream of patients that passed through these sterile walls. But what happened in the next 5 minutes would expose a web of corruption, abuse, and secrets that ran deeper than anyone imagined. Nurse Chun, Dr. Harrison's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade. Did you even read this chart before walking in here? Because if you had, you'd know that this patient's medication schedule was completely wrong. Sarah's face flushed as she quickly reviewed the chart. The medication was correct. She had double-checked it herself just minutes ago. But challenging Dr. Harrison publicly was career suicide. She had learned that the hard way. I'm sorry, doctor. Let me. Sorry doesn't fix incompetence, Dr. Harrison interrupted, his voice rising. This is exactly the kind of careless mistake that puts patients at risk. How did someone like you even get through nursing school? The words hung in the air like poison. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the chart tighter. She could feel the patient's presence in the room, a silent witness to her humiliation. But what if the patient listening held a secret powerful enough to destroy careers? What if this wasn't just another routine visit, and this wasn't just another ordinary patient? In bed 312, David Torres lay perfectly still, but his mind was racing. Behind his closed eyelids, he was memorizing every word, every gesture, every cruel inflection in the doctor's voice. Because David Torres had been waiting 3 long years for this moment. What happened next would expose far more than anyone expected. St. Mary's General Hospital buzzed with its usual morning chaos. The antiseptic smell, mixed with the sounds of beeping machines, hurried footsteps, and muffled conversations created the symphony of a place where life and death decisions were made daily. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the linoleum floors as nurses rushed between rooms, their soft-soled shoes squeaking against the polished surface. Patients waited anxiously in their beds, some recovering, others preparing for procedures that would change their lives forever. Dr. Richard Harrison had built his reputation as one of the hospital's most skilled surgeons over 15 years. His colleagues respected him, administrators praised his success rates, and patients trusted him with their lives. But behind closed doors, those who worked closest with him knew a different truth. Harrison was methodical in his cruelty, particularly toward the nursing staff. He had perfected the art of public humiliation, always careful to frame his attacks as concerns for patient safety. It was a strategy that had protected him for years. Who could argue against a doctor who claimed to be advocating for better patient care? Sarah Chun had been working at St. Mary's for 8 years. She had entered nursing with dreams of helping people, of making a difference in their darkest moments. She was known for her gentle touch with elderly patients, her ability to calm anxious families, and her meticulous attention to detail. But Dr. Harrison had slowly chipped away at her confidence with each public criticism, each dismissive comment, each time he had made her feel small in front of others. She wasn't the first nurse to bear the brunt of his psychological warfare. 3 others had transferred to different departments in the past 2 years, unable to tolerate the constant stress of working under him. 2 more had left the profession entirely. In room 312, David Torres appeared to be just another middle-aged patient recovering from routine gallbladder surgery. His chart showed he was unemployed, living alone, with no emergency contacts listed. To the staff, he was unremarkable, quiet, polite, and requiring minimal care. He rarely spoke beyond answering direct medical questions, and he seemed to spend most of his time sleeping or staring out the window. But appearances can be deceiving. David's eyes took in everything. The way Dr. Harrison's jaw tightened when a nurse asked a question. The slight tremor in Sarah's voice when she had to present information to him. The way other staff members seemed to hold their breath when Harrison entered a room. The tension between the doctor and nurse wasn't new. David had observed it building over the 3 days since his admission. He had watched Harrison dismiss Sarah's suggestions, correct her in front of other patients, and generally treat her as if she were incompetent despite her obvious skill and compassion. But this time, someone important was listening. The humiliation in room 312 was not an isolated incident. It was part of a carefully orchestrated pattern that Dr. Harrison had perfected over years of practice. Sarah remembered her first encounter with him 3 years ago. She had been assigned to assist in a complex surgery, and she had made a minor error in preparing the surgical tray. Instead of quietly correcting it, Harrison had stopped the entire procedure to lecture her in front of the surgical team, the anesthesiologist, and 2 medical students. "This is what happens when we lower our standards," he had said, his voice dripping with disdain. One small mistake like this could cost a patient their life. The error was so minor that it wouldn't have affected the surgery in any way, but Harrison had made it sound like a catastrophic failure. Sarah had left the operating room feeling humiliated and questioning her competence. Since then, the pattern had only intensified. Harrison would find fault with her work even when there was none. He would question her decisions in front of patients, making them doubt her ability to care for them. He would assign her the most difficult patients and then criticize her when she struggled to meet impossible expectations. Other nurses had warned Sarah about Harrison when she first started working his floor. "Just keep your head down," they advised. "Don't give him any reason to notice you." But Sarah's dedication to her patients made invisibility impossible. She advocated for their needs, asked questions about their treatment, and refused to cut corners, all things that put her in Harrison's crosshairs. The worst part was that she couldn't fight back. Harrison was untouchable. His surgical skills were undeniable, his patients had excellent outcomes, and hospital administrators valued his contributions to their reputation. When nurses had tried to complain about his behavior in the past, they were told they were being too sensitive or needed to toughen up for the demanding environment of surgical care. Sarah had considered leaving many times. She would lie awake at night, her stomach churning with anxiety about the next day's shift. She had started having panic attacks in the hospital bathroom, trying to compose herself before facing another day of potential humiliation. But she stayed because of the patients. She had chosen nursing to help people, and despite Harrison's best efforts to break her spirit, she still believed in that mission. She couldn't abandon the elderly man in room 308 who was terrified of his upcoming procedure, or the young mother in room 315 who was worried about her children while she recovered. What Sarah didn't know was that her dedication had been noticed by someone who had the power to finally hold Dr. Harrison accountable. In room 312, David Torres had been watching and listening for 3 days. He had seen how Sarah checked on her patients throughout the night, how she stayed late to comfort a frightened elderly woman, how she advocated for pain medication when other staff had dismissed a patient's complaints. He had also seen how Harrison treated her and others. The pattern was clear to anyone who cared to look. Little did the doctor know, this patient wasn't just another name on the chart. David Torres lay in his hospital bed, but his mind was 3 years and 200 miles away, in a different hospital room where he had held his daughter's hand as she took her final breath. Maria had been 28 years old, a kindergarten teacher with her whole life ahead of her. She had gone into the hospital for what should have been a routine appendectomy. The surgeon had assured David and his wife that it was a simple procedure, that Maria would be home in a few days. But complications had arisen during surgery. The surgeon had nicked an artery, causing significant internal bleeding. Instead of immediately addressing the error, he had attempted to complete the original procedure while Maria's condition deteriorated. By the time he finally called for assistance, it was too late. Maria had died, not from her appendicitis, but from surgical incompetence and arrogance. The surgeon who had killed his daughter was Dr. Michael Stevens. He had blamed the complications on Maria's unusual anatomy, and suggested that the outcome was unforeseeable. The hospital had closed ranks around him. Their lawyers had made settlement offers with non-disclosure agreements, and Stevens had continued practicing medicine as if nothing had happened. But David had investigated. He had spent months learning about medical procedures, surgical protocols, and patient safety standards. He had discovered that Stevens had a history of similar complications that were never properly investigated. He had found other families who had lost loved ones to preventable errors, all silenced by legal settlements and institutional protection. David had tried every official channel. He had filed complaints with the medical board, contacted patient advocacy groups, and even hired lawyers. But Stevens was protected by the same system that now protected Dr. Harrison, a system that valued reputation over accountability, that protected doctors who brought prestige to institutions regardless of their behavior towards staff or patients. The investigation into Maria's death had been cursory. The medical board had accepted the hospital's internal review, which had found no evidence of wrongdoing. The case had been closed, and Stevens had received no discipline beyond a recommendation for additional training. That was when David had realized that justice would have to come from outside the system. He had spent 2 years researching, planning, and preparing. He had learned that Stevens had moved to St. Mary's General Hospital, where he worked alongside Dr. Harrison. He had discovered that the two doctors were friends, that they socialized together, and that they shared similar attitudes toward patient care and staff treatment. David's admission to St. Mary's wasn't for gallbladder surgery that had been performed months ago at another hospital. He had manipulated his medical records, paid cash for the procedure, and arranged to be admitted under an assumed condition that would require several days of observation. He was an investigative journalist, though his official credentials had been carefully obscured. For 20 years, he had specialized in exposing corruption in public institutions. His work had led to the resignation of corrupt politicians, the closure of fraudulent businesses, and the prosecution of dozens of criminals. But this investigation was personal. As David watched Dr. Harrison's cruel treatment of Nurse Chun, he saw the same arrogance, the same disregard for human dignity, the same abuse of power that had cost his daughter her life. He saw how the system protected bullies like Harrison while vulnerable people, patients and staff alike, suffered in silence. What the doctor couldn't see was that this patient had been waiting for this moment for years. After her humiliating encounter with Dr. Harrison, Sarah Chin sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, her hands shaking as she tried to insert her key into the ignition. The tears she had held back all morning finally came, hot and angry against her cheeks. She thought about her mother, who had immigrated to America with nothing but dreams of her daughter having a better life. Sarah had worked 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school, had graduated with honors, had dedicated her life to caring for others. And for what? To be treated like an incompetent child by a man whose ego mattered more than patient care? That night, Sarah made a decision that terrified her. She logged into the hospital's employee portal and filed a formal complaint against Dr. Harrison for unprofessional conduct and workplace harassment. She documented the incident from that morning, but also included a detailed account of months of similar behavior. She described how Harrison's public criticisms had affected her ability to do her job effectively, how his hostile environment had impacted patient care, and how his pattern of abuse had driven other qualified nurses away from the department. As she typed her statement, Sarah's heart pounded. She knew that filing this complaint could end her career at St. Mary's. Harrison had connections throughout the hospital hierarchy. He brought in millions of dollars in revenue through his surgical practice. She was just a nurse, replaceable, disposable. But she also thought about the other nurses who had suffered under Harrison's tyranny. She thought about the patients who deserved better care than what they receive in an environment of fear and intimidation. She thought about her own self-respect, which had been slowly eroding under months of psychological abuse. She submitted the complaint at 11:47 p.m. Meanwhile, in room 312, David Torres was making phone calls. To anyone listening, he appeared to be arranging post-discharge care with family members. But his conversations were with a network of sources he had cultivated over months of investigation. "The pattern is exactly what we expected." He spoke quietly into his phone. "Harrison's behavior with staff mirrors what we've documented about Stevens. The institutional protection, the dismissal of complaints, the systematic silencing of victims. It's all here." David had been documenting everything during his stay at St. Mary's. He had recorded conversations using devices concealed in his personal belongings. He had photographed documents left carelessly within view. He had interviewed staff members who thought they were just making small talk with a friendly patient. Most importantly, he had built relationships with nurses and support staff who were willing to speak on a record about the culture of abuse within the surgical department. His investigation had revealed that Dr. Harrison's behavior was not just tolerated, but enabled by hospital administration. Complaints against him were routinely dismissed or buried in bureaucratic processes. Nurses who spoke up were labeled as difficult and found themselves assigned to less desirable shifts or departments. The hospital's own internal surveys showed that staff turnover in Harrison's department was nearly double the hospital average. Exit interviews revealed consistent patterns of workplace harassment and professional bullying. But none of this information had ever been acted upon. David's sources had also provided him with information about Dr. Stevens, Harrison's friend and colleague. The two men had a history of covering for each other, of providing false testimony in malpractice cases, and of using their positions to silence whistleblowers. The complaint that Sarah had filed would be the catalyst David needed to bring his investigation into the open. He had been waiting for someone with the courage to step forward, someone whose credibility couldn't be easily dismissed. By morning, rumors were spreading through the hospital. Sarah's complaint had been forwarded to the Human Resources Department, where it would normally disappear into a lengthy review process designed to exhaust the complainant's patience and resolve. But this time will be different. The truth was about to surface, and it would shake the entire hospital. 3 days after Sarah's complaint was filed, David Torres requested a meeting with the hospital's patient advocate. It was a reasonable request. Patients often had concerns about their care that needed to be addressed through proper channels. The patient advocate, Linda Morrison, arrived at room 312 expecting a routine conversation about billing questions or discharge planning. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with one of the most respected investigative journalists in the region. "Ms. Morrison," David said quietly, "my name is David Torres, and I write for the Metropolitan Chronicle. But before we discuss my professional credentials, I need to tell you about my daughter Maria." Linda's expression changed as David began to speak. He told her about Maria's death 3 years ago, about the surgeon whose negligence had cost his daughter her life, about the system that had protected the guilty while silencing the victims. "Dr. Michael Stevens, who killed my daughter, works in this hospital," David continued. "He and Dr. Harrison are colleagues, friends, and they share a pattern of behavior that puts patients at risk and create a hostile environment for staff." David produced a briefcase that had been hidden in his bedside table. Inside were hundreds of pages of documentation, medical records, witness statements, financial documents, and correspondence between hospital administrators. "I've been investigating this hospital for 8 months, he explained. "I've documented systematic cover-ups of medical errors, financial fraud and billing practices, and a culture of abuse that has driven dozens of qualified medical professionals away from this institution." Linda Morrison had been working in healthcare administration for 15 years. She had seen her share of complaints and investigations. But the evidence that David spread across his hospital bed table was unlike anything she had encountered. There were recorded conversations between Dr. Harrison and Dr. Stevens discussing how to handle problematic nurses. There were emails from hospital administrators instructing department heads to dismiss complaints without investigation. There were financial records showing that the hospital had paid millions in secret settlements to victims of medical malpractice, while publicly maintaining their doctor's innocence. Most damning of all were the medical records that showed a pattern of preventable complications and surgeries performed by both doctors. Records that had been falsified, evidence that had been destroyed, and witnesses who had been intimidated into silence. "The complaint filed by Nurse Chun is part of a larger pattern," David explained. "She's not the first nurse to report Harrison's abusive behavior. but she might be the first whose complaint isn't buried or dismissed. David revealed that he had been working with a team of attorneys who specialized in medical malpractice and institutional fraud. They had been building a case against St. Mary's for months, waiting for the right moment to go public. That moment had come when Sarah Chun showed the courage to file her complaint. I've documented 17 similar cases of workplace harassment and abuse in this department alone, David continued. I have testimony from former employees, patients who witnessed inappropriate behavior, and evidence of systematic retaliation against anyone who tried to speak up. Linda Morrison realized that she was looking at evidence of institutional corruption that went far beyond a single doctor's bad behavior. This was about a hospital that had prioritized reputation and revenue over patient safety and employee welfare. But the most shocking detail, David said, is that Dr. Stevens isn't the only doctor in this hospital who has killed patients through negligence. Dr. Harrison has his own history of preventable complications that have been covered up by hospital administration. David produced medical records showing 3 cases over the past 5 years where Harrison's surgical errors had resulted in patient deaths. In each case, the hospital's internal review had found no wrongdoing. The families had been offered settlements in exchange for non-disclosure agreements. The cases had never been reported to state medical boards or patient safety organizations. Dr. Harrison humiliated Nurse Chun because she represents everything he fears, David explained. She's competent, caring, and ethical. She asks questions when things don't seem right. She advocates for patients, even when it's inconvenient. She's exactly the kind of person who might notice when something goes wrong and have the courage to report it. Linda Morrison sat in stunned silence as she processed the magnitude of what David was showing her. This wasn't just about workplace harassment or even individual medical malpractice. This was about an institutional conspiracy to protect dangerous doctors while silencing anyone who tried to hold them accountable. And when the doctor finally found out who was sitting in that hospital bed, it was too late. The confrontation began at 7:23 a.m. on Thursday morning during routine rounds. Dr. Harrison entered room 312 with his usual commanding presence, expecting to find the same quiet, unremarkable patient who had been occupying the bed for nearly a week. Instead, he found David Torres sitting upright, fully dressed in street clothes, with a stack of documents spread across his bedside table. Linda Morrison, the patient advocate, sat in a chair beside the bed, along with 2 people Harrison didn't recognize, a woman in a business suit and a man with a recorder. Dr. Harrison, David said calmly, I think it's time we had a conversation. Harrison's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion. Mr. Torres, you should be resting. Visiting hours don't start until... My name is David Torres, David interrupted, and I'm an investigative journalist with the Metropolitan Chronicle. These are my colleagues, attorney Jennifer Walsh and my research assistant Mark Shin. We're here to discuss your treatment of hospital staff and your pattern of medical negligence. The blood drained from Harrison's face. He looked toward the door as if considering escape, but Mark Chun had quietly moved to block the exit. I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, Harrison said, his voice rising, but I'm calling security. Before you do that, David said, producing a small recording device, you might want to listen to this. The device played back Harrison's voice from earlier in the week. Sorry doesn't fix incompetence. This is exactly the kind of careless mistake that puts patients at risk. How did someone like you even get through nursing school? Harrison's face went white. You can't record conversations in a hospital without consent. That's illegal. Actually, Jennifer Walsh spoke for the first time. As a patient in a semi-private room, Mr. Torres had every right to record his own medical interactions. But that's not what we're really here to discuss. David opened a folder and pulled out a photograph. Do you recognize this woman, Dr. Harrison? Harrison glanced at the photo, a young woman in a graduation cap and gown, smiling brightly at the camera. I don't know who that is. Her name was Maria Torres. She was my daughter. She died 3 years ago during a routine appendectomy performed by your colleague, Dr. Michael Stevens. Harrison's composure began to crack. I don't know what you're talking about. I wasn't involved in any. But you were involved in the cover-up, David interrupted. You provided false testimony during the internal review. You helped Stevens falsify medical records. And you've been part of a systematic effort to silence anyone who might expose the truth about what happened. David produced more documents, emails between Harrison and Stevens, correspondence with hospital administrators, financial records showing payments made to silence witnesses. The real twist, David continued, isn't just who the patient was, but what I uncovered about your past. He opened another folder, revealing medical records, death certificates, and legal documents. 3 patients have died under your care in the past 5 years due to surgical errors that were entirely preventable. The hospital covered up each incident, paid settlements to the families, and allowed you to continue practicing as if nothing had happened. Harrison tried to leave, but Jennifer Walsh stepped forward. Dr. Harrison, as of this morning, formal complaints have been filed with the State Medical Board, the Hospital Licensing Authority, and the District Attorney's Office. You're not going anywhere until this conversation is finished. At that moment, Sarah Chun appeared in the doorway. She had been called by Linda Morrison and asked to witness the confrontation. Her presence seemed to break something in Harrison's demeanor. He said, pointing at Sarah, you planned this whole thing. You're trying to destroy my career because you can't handle honest feedback about your performance. Sarah stepped into the room, her voice steady for the first time in months. Dr. Harrison, I filed a complaint about your abusive behavior because it was the right thing to do. But I had no idea about any of this. She gestured to the evidence spread across David's bed. I had no idea that you've been covering up patient deaths, falsifying records, or participating in fraud. I just wanted the harassment to stop. David looked at Harrison with the cold stare of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. My daughter trusted the medical system to save her life. Instead, your friend killed her through negligence, and you helped cover it up. Now I'm going to make sure that both of you face the consequences of your actions. The room fell silent except for the sound of the recorder capturing every word. The most shocking detail was yet to come. Within hours of the confrontation in room 312, St. Mary's General Hospital became the center of a media storm that would change everything. David Torres had not been working alone. His investigation was part of a coordinated effort involving the Metropolitan Chronicle's investigative team, the State Health Department, the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Unit, and attorneys representing dozens of victims of medical malpractice. The first news story broke at 6 p.m. that evening. Undercover investigation exposes massive cover-up at St. Mary's Hospital. But it was just the beginning. Over the following days, the story expanded as more evidence emerged. David had documented not just the abusive behavior toward staff, but a systematic pattern of fraud that had cost patients their lives and their life savings. Dr. Harrison and Dr. Stevens had been part of a network of physicians who manipulated surgical schedules to maximize billing, performed unnecessary procedures on elderly patients, and falsified medical records to hide their mistakes. The scheme had generated millions of dollars in fraudulent billing over 5 years. Hospital administrators had known about the fraud, but had chosen to cover it up rather than risk the scandal of prosecution. They had silenced whistleblowers with legal threats, destroyed evidence, and intimidated witnesses to protect the hospital's reputation. The evidence David had gathered included recorded conversations between doctors discussing how to falsify records, financial documents showing payments made to silence victims' families, medical records that had been altered to hide surgical errors, testimony from former employees who had been fired for reporting misconduct, patient records showing a pattern of unnecessary surgeries and inflated billing. Sarah Chun found herself at the center of the media attention, but this time as a hero rather than a victim. Her decision to file a formal complaint had provided the legal opening that investigators needed to bring their evidence into the open. Other nurses began coming forward with their own stories of harassment and abuse. The pattern was clear. Doctors like Harrison had created an environment where staff were afraid to question decisions or report problems, making it easier to hide their crimes. The investigation revealed that Sarah's experience was not unique. 17 other nurses had filed complaints against Harrison over the past 3 years. All of those complaints have been dismissed or buried by hospital administration without proper investigation. 3 nurses who had tried to report suspicious billing practices have been fired on pretextual grounds. 2 others have been threatened with lawsuits if they discuss their experiences publicly. The systematic silencing of healthcare workers had created an environment where dangerous doctors could operate without oversight or accountability. Federal investigators seized the hospital's computers and medical records. They found evidence of fraud totaling more than $50 million over 5 years. They discovered that patient deaths had been systematically underreported to state health authorities. Most shocking of all, they found evidence that the fraud had been coordinated across multiple hospitals in the region. Dr. Harrison and Dr. Stevens were part of a larger network of physicians who shared information about how to manipulate billing systems and avoid detection. The investigation expanded to include other hospitals, other doctors, and other victims. What had started as one father's quest for justice for his daughter had become one of the largest healthcare fraud cases in state history. Dr. Harrison was arrested at his home on charges of healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and involuntary manslaughter. Dr. Stevens was taken into custody at the hospital while attempting to destroy evidence in his office. Hospital administrators who had participated in the cover-up were fired and faced criminal charges. The hospital's license was suspended, pending a complete investigation of their practices. For Sarah Chun, the vindication was overwhelming. She had thought she was just filing a complaint about workplace harassment. Instead, she had helped expose a criminal conspiracy that had cost dozens of lives. But the most shocking detail was yet to come. 6 months after David Torres checked into room 312 at St. Mary's General Hospital, he stood in a courtroom watching Dr. Richard Harrison receive a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. Harrison had been convicted on 37 counts of healthcare fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and 3 counts of involuntary manslaughter. The evidence that David had gathered during his investigation had been crucial to securing the conviction. Dr. Michael Stevens, the surgeon who had killed David's daughter Maria, received an even harsher sentence, 22 years in prison and permanent revocation of his medical license. The case against him had been strengthened by evidence discovered during the investigation of Harrison and the hospital. But the most shocking revelation had emerged during the trial testimony. David Torres was not just an investigative journalist seeking justice for his daughter's death. He was also a former federal prosecutor who had specialized in healthcare fraud cases before leaving government service to become a journalist. His investigation of St. Mary's Hospital had been conducted with the knowledge and cooperation of federal law enforcement agencies. His undercover operation in the hospital had been part of a larger investigation into healthcare fraud that spanned multiple states. David had chosen to go undercover as a patient because traditional investigative methods had failed to penetrate the conspiracy of silence that protected corrupt doctors. By experiencing the hospital environment as a patient, he had been able to document abuse and negligence that would have been impossible to prove through conventional investigation. The network of corrupt physicians that had included Harrison and Stevens extended to 12 hospitals across 3 states. In total, 47 doctors and administrators were convicted of crimes ranging from fraud to manslaughter. The conspiracy had resulted in at least 38 preventable patient deaths and more than $200 million in fraudulent billing. For Sarah Chun, the resolution brought both vindication and a new mission. She had been promoted to head of nursing quality assurance at the hospital, which was now under new management. Her role involved implementing systems to protect both patients and staff from the kind of abuse that had flourished under the previous administration. The new hospital policies included mandatory reporting of suspicious medical practices, protection for whistleblowers, and regular independent audits of patient safety protocols. Sarah worked with patient advocacy groups to ensure that complaints were properly investigated rather than dismissed. She also became a spokesperson for healthcare worker rights, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the importance of creating environments where staff could speak up about problems without fear of retaliation. The case led to significant changes in healthcare regulation at the state and federal levels. New laws required hospitals to report all complaints against physicians to state medical boards. Hospitals that failed to properly investigate misconduct faced financial penalties and license suspension. Patient advocacy groups used the St. Mary's case as an example of why healthcare institutions needed greater oversight and transparency. The case became a catalyst for nationwide reforms in how hospitals handle internal complaints and investigations. For David Torres, the successful prosecution brought a measure of closure, though it could never bring back his daughter. He returned to journalism, but now focused specifically on exposing corruption in healthcare systems. His investigation of St. Mary's had become a model for other journalists investigating medical fraud and abuse. The book he wrote about the investigation, titled The Patient in Room 312, became a bestseller and was credited with inspiring other victims of medical malpractice to come forward with their stories. Most importantly, the case demonstrated that even the most powerful and protected individuals could be held accountable when victims had the courage to speak up and when the right people were listening. The hospital that had once protected dangerous doctors at the expense of patient safety had been transformed into an institution focused on transparency, accountability, and genuine patient care. In the end, it turned out that the patient in room 312 had been exactly what the hospital needed most: someone who refused to accept that abuse and corruption were the price of medical care. Sarachan often reflected on how a single moment of courage, filing that complaint against Dr. Harrison, had led to such massive changes. She realized that most people have more power than they think to challenge injustice, but they need to be willing to use it even when the personal cost seems too high. The case proved that institutional change is possible, but it requires individuals who are willing to take risks to expose the truth. It requires people who refuse to accept that this is just the way things are, when the way things are involves harming innocent people. What would you have done if you were the nurse in this situation? Would you have had the courage to file a complaint knowing it might end your career? Do you think the doctor got what he deserved? Or was the punishment too harsh for someone who was just psychologically abusive? The story of room 312 reminds us that every person has the power to make a difference, but that power only matters when we choose to use it. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply refuse to stay silent when we witness injustice. If this story has made you think about the importance of speaking up against abuse and corruption, share it with others who might need to hear it. And remember, the person sitting quietly in the corner might be the one who has the power to change everything. Sometimes justice takes time, but it only happens when people decide that enough is enough.